He played while the building slept. The notes were thin as thread and brave as a heart's first pulse. They shivered under his bow and floated up the atrium like frightened birds seeking light. No one heard. The midnight lobby had been emptied hours before, the marble cool and gleaming under soft recessed lights. The janitor's cart and its slotted brooms waited like tired sentinels by the doorway. A broken violin lay across his knee, chin tucked into the cracked ebony. He drew the bow and let the memory do the rest. Elias Moreau had learned how to fill a silence the hard way. Silence could be a blanket that smothered. He had known that silence since his wife had taken the long train out and never come back, since the hospital's fluorescent lights had hummed their cruel lullaby, since the small boy's face sometimes looked like a map of losses. His hands knew the work of night, collecting discarded coffee cups, sweeping the crumbs and cigarette ash of other people's days, coaxing the lobby's tired carpet back into pride. They also remembered scales. Inside Elias, the music was not technique. It was confession. He had stopped promising himself thousands of performances in grand halls years ago, shutting the door on ambition the way one shutters windows in a storm. But an instrument that survived a life of neglect still remembered resonance. The violin's varnish had peeled, its bridge had been repaired with clumsy fingers and stubborn glue. The E string held only when coaxed. It screamed sometimes. He had taped a small piece of cloth to the lower bow to make holding it less jagged. Yet when his bow pressed and his breath steadied, whole summers fell into place and his small son's hand around a paper cup became a metronome. The first notes were hesitant. They trembled with old guilt and new necessity. He tucked the violin under his chin and let a simple folk tune spill out, a melody he had hummed to his son when dinners were hot and bright as a lantern flame. He poured the tiredness of his body into the phrasing, the ache of bone into vibrato. He played the parts of himself he could not say. Across the street and 2 floors up, Gabriel Wynne stood in an anonymous hotel bar that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and expensive coffee. He had been on a plane less than 12 hours and was allergic to airport turbulence and counterfeit small talk. A critic by trade, he measured art with the assuredness of someone who had curated taste like gemstones. His name moved across posters and mastheads, his opinions could vault an untried composer to overnight fame or consign a venerable institution to shame. He lived in the precise architecture of acclaim and disillusion. His apartment was all clean angles and curated absence, because he had learned that clutter invited sympathy and he could not afford to give it. Gabriel felt hollow where most men felt certainty. Years of sharpening judgments had left him good at finding flaws. He had learned to protect himself with a quick wit and a finer pen. Inside, there was a wound no checkbook could fill, a scandal 3 seasons ago, a blunted reputation while his colleagues circled, pen knives out. He had weathered it, retooled his public persona, but not the private place where trust had lodged once. That night, in the concrete and glass canyon of the city, he walked by habit without noticing the world until something like music pushed the door open in his chest. It was faint at first, a gossamer thread, then a phrase that knifed through his practiced indifference and left him motionless on the sidewalk. He had chased a line of a sentence before. He had never chased a melody. Elias did not notice the man in the doorway at first. He did not know the name affiliates and festival boards whispered when he thought he heard a plane overhead. He only knew the lobby's echoes and a child's breath on his neck in the middle of the night. He played the tune he had kept blood quiet, a lullaby of small mercies. He played the way someone digs with bare hands for a coin in cold soil, methodical, desperate, reverent. Gabriel felt the world fold. From his vantage point, silhouetted against the city's sodium lamps, the lobby looked like a cathedral whose only worshipper knelt at the wrong hour. He watched Elias' back curve around the instrument, saw the hand that shouldn't have the temperament for delicate work pull the bow. He felt a strange, naive assumption loosen inside him, the assumption that brilliance wore fine clothing and that greatness would present itself in announcements and press kits. This was not that. This was a raggedness that had more truth than many engineered nights he had attended, an imperfection that bared the soul. He moved closer without thinking, as if a law in him required proximity to the source. The janitor did not look up. The melody folded into itself and returned, a refrain of memory. Gabriel stood framed by the glass doors, the city breathing around him, and for the first time in years found no words to capture his reaction. The lobby was empty enough to let the violin's flaws speak. The E string screamed twice, a startled bird. Elias cursed under his breath, an old, soft word like a stone slipped into water. He steadied himself, found the broken seam with his fingertips, and continued. His jaw was calloused from a life of opening locks and turning keys for others. The violin sound was not pretty. It was honest. Gabriel had built his career on finding art's prettiest truths and then cutting through them. He had trained himself to detach, to annotate prejudice, to separate empathy from judgment. He had seen thousands of concerts, many flawless under the dirigiste's baton, many hollow because rehearsed aplomb had replaced urgency. But urgency lived in this man's bow. It made Gabriel's chest ache and, worse, it accused him of a comfort he had not permitted for himself. Elias felt a presence then, a quiet weight at the doorway. He lifted his head and, for the first time that night, glanced at the man watching him. The man was younger than Elias had guessed by his posture. He wore a coat cut in expensive tailoring, welted shoes, a face that seemed bored of its own handsomeness. His expression was blank at first, and then, slowly, like a photograph developing, angrier with feeling than indifference. For the moment they regarded each other without the buffer of assumption. Gabriel recognized the calluses on Elias' knuckles as proof of honest labor and not hardship's parlor trick. He noticed the way Elias held breath like a metronome for the small boy's rhythm, the way his shoulders hunched with a burden carved somewhere else. Gabriel's world catalogued such details with clinical affection. He catalogued them now and felt a tenderness that was almost lethal in its unfamiliarity. Elias stopped playing abruptly when he saw Gabriel's eyes. He set the violin on his knee, exactly as he had always done, and let the silence hammer against his ribs. He expected a comment of contempt, a polite applause, perhaps a coin for a tune. He instead found the man's mouth open, gaze unabashedly stunned. Gabriel started, and then found the sentence collapsing under the weight of what he felt, a critic's vocabulary scrambling for correspondences it had never learned. He had no prepackaged pronouncement for a man like this in this context. He had editorial aphorisms for chamber recitals and festival finales, not for a midnight man pressing a borrowed bow into a life. Elias read the hesitation like a script already familiar. People often did not know what to do in front of humility. Most of them retreated toward pity or an awkward compliment. Elias wanted nothing of those offerings. He had, over years of scraping nights, grown a contempt for empty charity. It dried like dust and left nothing to eat. He had begun to play not for meager praise but because the music served as a measure of himself, proof he still had arms that could shape something lovely from small things. Gabriel apologized, clumsy and surprisingly human. The words were inefficient for the feeling they tried to hold. He said, "I did not mean to interrupt." Elias blinked. "You didn't," he said simply, and let the phrase be what it could, a bridge, a dam, a simple fact. They stood like two strangers in a story that had not yet found its tone. Gabriel looked at the battered violin with a critic's curiosity, tracing the scars as if they might reveal a composition's genesis. Elias watched Gabriel's eyes work, the narrowing, the cataloguing, the disbelief, and felt an involuntary readiness to justify himself. But the music had already said things he could not have boxed into sentences. He had given his life away to small acts of repair and imagined grandeur was a stranger at the door. Gabriel swallowed a response and, in place of criticism, offered a question. "You play?" Elias laughed softly. It was not mirth. "I did," he answered. "I don't perform, not really." "For Gabe," he said, naming his son in a way that startled him with how light it felt to make the boy present. "He's asleep." "Your name is Elias?" Gabriel ventured, as if a name might confer a reality in a way men like them needed. "Yes," Elias confirmed. "You?" "Gabriel Wynne," the critic said. There was no pretense. For all his public persona, Gabriel had become used to names as flags of temporary alliances. In the hush of the lobby he heard his own name as if for the first time. They fell into an awkward, honest conversation. Gabriel had questions that were not quite journalistic. He asked about the violin's history, about who had fixed the bridge, about what the tune had meant. Elias answered with small factual things. It had been his father's, its varnish had been burned in the sun, the bridge had been mended by hand, the bow hair was old and frayed. He also answered with things he could not have said without the possibility of being judged, the way music allowed him to commit guilt to sound instead of words, the fear of failing his son. He told Gabriel, in the way men often talk when they are unexpectedly safe, about the job's rhythm, its humiliations, and its dignity. Gabriel listened and catalogued. He felt something in him shift, an accountant reassigning funds from contempt to something like gratitude. He felt the familiar critic's mind begin to draw lines between this man's unpolished talent and a larger, cunning network of appointment and neglect. He imagined editorials, essays, op-eds. He also felt the more dangerous impulse, the desire to see Elias in a staged moment, a way for both of them to be transformed by a public revelation. Elias, meanwhile, used the exchange to measure Gabriel. The man's accent, the hints of disdain softened into fascination, his hands absent of instrument knowledge, his eyes trained to evaluate. Elias felt both flattered and wary. He had been used to being looked at by the wrong kind of hunger, by people wanting a story on their terms, a scrap of human content they could parade as a moral exposition. He had learned to keep pieces of himself private. Yet the lobby's acoustics and the cold air had dropped something like a covenant between them. What had occurred was not for sale. They parted, Gabriel with an invitation that felt at once impulsive and professional: "Come to a rehearsal tomorrow. Small. You can play. No fanfare." Elias considered the offer and then refused. "I don't play for crowds," he said, and the phrase had the weight of a crushed cigarette butt. "I play for Gabe. For the night." Gabriel's face moved in a way that was an admission. He had offered in the comfort of his own hunger. "Then let me host you. Quiet. Just to hear you. No cameras." Elias thought of the small apartment where his son's breath was steady and the broken violin lived in a battered case beneath a stack of unpaid notices. He thought of the chaos that a famous critic's intrusion could bring, of people with good intentions and hungry hands. He also thought of what Gabriel's interest meant, that someone who had the power to make or break a reputation might be willing to do the opposite. He swallowed. "I'll think about it," he said. In the morning, Elias told himself he had declined. In the evening, when his son had homework spread like a map on the kitchen table and oatmeal stains on the counter glowed like old planets, he found himself saying yes. The invitation was not to a gala but to a rehearsal at a small modern venue Gabriel had access to, one of those black boxes with sympathetic lighting and a director who knew the voice of a critic and the weight of a reputation. It was intimate, Gabriel had promised. It would not be public. Elias prepared the violin with a level of reverence he reserved for holidays. He scoured the fingerboard with old oil, tuned against the high whine of a neighbor child's violin, and dusted away the little accidents of city life that had nested in the E-string. He had no formal stage clothes. He wore a shirt washed several times and a jacket his wife had liked. He breathed and loaded himself with the small rituals of courage, a cup of bitter coffee, a 2-minute prayer, a kiss to his son's sleeping forehead. Gabriel spent the day like a man holding his breath. He had asked for a rehearsal and had meant the word's true limitation, not a spectacle but a private hearing. He called the venue director and arranged a late afternoon slot. He learned, with an old critic's discomfort, that his own colleagues had eyes for the story. He deflected them. He wanted this to be a single, unmarked moment, a test to see if the music he had heard in a lobby was as large as he had felt it. At the rehearsal space, the room smelled of fresh paint and old curtains. A single lamp hung like an eye. Gabriel watched Elias enter with the dignity of someone bringing a country meal to a city table. He saw the violin case like a traveler's pouch. Elias's hands moved with an economy of gesture that spoke of daily life, not the stage. He sat like a man returning home. Elias played and the room listened. Gabriel sat in the darkness and tried to separate the man from the myth he was building. The melody was not virtuoso pyrotechnics. It was not intended to be. There were slight slips, a wrong note or two that would, in another ear, have been an affront. But Gabriel felt something he had not felt in years. He felt a truth as plain and honest as a child's hand in the night. The music was not polished, it was needed. It had the kind of mistakes that proved the maker lived inside the creation. After the first piece, Gabriel moved forward and asked to speak with Elias. The director left them alone. Gabriel's questions were more personal now, about training, about why the man had left perhaps promising conservatories or teachers, about the years between. Elias answered with a precision that was not practiced. He had been good enough for scholarships once and had stepped away for reasons that kept coming into his chest like unexpected traffic. A sick parent, bills, an infant's hungry mouth, little truths that had made an artist accommodate life instead of life accommodating art. Gabriel registered each detail and felt a narrative forming in him, a story too neat yet painfully true, a man of talent sidelined into invisibility by circumstances. He felt, too, the critic's hunger to place this story into the wider culture, to give it a platform and a word that might make it legible to those who would consume it. He imagined a feature, a memoir, a string of reviews that could redeem Elias on command. He imagined, also, the possibility of claiming credit in the footnotes, of asserting that he had found this treasure. Elias did not need or want a person to create his redemption. He needed an honest client who would value what he wanted to do, teach his son and other children like him, not just play grand halls and leave. The violin had been an instrument of survival for him, a means to tether himself to something worth more than wages. The stage would mean more money, yes, but more tours and less time with the small life he had rebuilt like a house with missing nails. The rehearsal that day ended without fanfare. Gabriel walked Elias home because a month of rain had recently made walking an act of solidarity. They had more conversation on the sidewalk than any two would-be allies might have expected. They found themselves speaking of failure not as event but as climate. They traded the small humiliations that had sharpened them, colleagues who had been kinder in public and cruel in private, missed trains of opportunity, and, for Elias, a result that had been the removal of a right to custody for a season until he could prove he had stability. Gabriel listened. He felt humility in the listening, a sensation he had not indulged in for years. It tasted like relief. He thought of his own wound, the scandal that had stripped him of a steady ascent, and realized the similarity. Both of them had known what public judgment could do. He decided, in a way that surprised him, to act in a manner that would not wound. The crisis arrived the week after. It was not a singular, neat catastrophe but a fractured series of failures that widened like a crack across Gabriel's world. The city was gripped by a sudden controversy. An avant-garde festival that Gabriel had helped organize found itself at the center of public outrage. A commissioned piece had been accused of plagiarism, an accusation that undermined the festival's credibility and threatened its primary sponsor's withdrawal. Public anger grew into petitions. The board demanded a fix and, with publications already leaning toward retribution, Gabriel's role as head commentator on the festival's quality was not merely advisory now, it was instrumental. He called in experts, he convened lawyers, he sat in tense panels where technicalities were flung like sharp knives. The festival's artistic director, a man whose life was made of risk-taking, insisted this was a misunderstanding. The board demanded an immediate demonstration of original work, a proof of authorship that the piece did not possess in a way that would satisfy the sponsors. The situation escalated. An external reviewer declared the piece derivative, a prominent patron announced they might retract funding, and Gabriel's own name, attached to the festival's image, vibrated with the risk of collapse. The usual channels of power failed. Contracts could not fabricate genius, credentials could not conjure a living, breathing originality in a week. Experts argued and new accusations blossomed. Gabriel felt the board's trust sliding like sand. He tried to fight back with words, with carefully calibrated reports, but the thing that had to be proven was not a legal argument. It was authenticity. Late one night, exhausted and furious, Gabriel found himself at the little restaurant by the rehearsal space, and then, by reflex or desperation, at the door of the hotel where Elias worked. He thought of how Elias had said he did not perform for crowds. He thought of that honesty. He thought of the violin in that trembling lobby and of the way the instrument's fractures seemed to hold truth, where so many curated productions were hollow. Elias was sweeping the night shift when Gabriel entered, the hall lit like a reluctant confession. He was not surprised to see him. Some meetings simply pressed the calendar in place. The critic explained the crisis, the board's demands, the impossibility of manufacture. He asked Elias for help in a way that swallowed pride and asked for risk. Elias listened. He recognized the problem's shape, not a technicality but a need for moral proof, a demonstration that something was born of a real human voice. "You want proof of authenticity," he said finally. "You want something so honest they cannot deny its origin." "Yes," Gabriel said. His voice had the weight of someone admitting fear. "We need a way to show that art can still arise from an honest place. That it does not require pedigree." Elias felt the old chest collapse with a familiar trade. He thought of the small boys' orchestra class and the way his son had kept a beat with his foot at a school performance. He thought of his neighbor's child who could not afford lessons. He thought of the violin as an instrument that did not belong to any set of credentials. His fingers brushed the wood of his instrument like an old lover's name. He considered the offer and then, in a flash of clarity that sometimes came after a life of made choices, saw that he could do this and remain faithful to himself. "I will help," he said. It was not a job, it was a task that demanded he bring his talent to bear in a way the board would not expect. Gabriel explained his plan, a live demonstration at the festival's central stage, but not with pomp. He wanted something unmanufactured. He wanted a moment where an audience could witness creation that wore the cost of its making on its sleeve. It would be brief and raw. Elias and a handful of children from underfunded community programs would perform a simple set of folk pieces and improvised variations that could not be accused of scholarly theft. Gabriel would write the piece up as a testament of authenticity, and a filmed segment would be distributed among board members and sponsors. Elias agreed in principle, but insisted on a condition that was the heart of his life: his son and other children like him must be included. He would not take a role that sidelined the purpose he had carried silently. He wanted the demonstration to be not about Elias but about a community. He wanted the performance to mean something long-term, to bring attention to music programs in neglected neighborhoods, not only to rescue a festival's image. Gabriel found himself oddly moved and immediately pragmatic. He knew the optics of such a plan. Critics love Cinderella stories, but sponsors even more so. He promised Elias he would not turn the demonstration into a viral anecdote with the cast as props. He promised to use every channel he had to safeguard the children's dignity. They worked in a compressed period of frantic activity. Elias gathered kids from a neighborhood music center he knew. He trained them in a back room of the building where he worked after hours, using mismatched chairs and borrowed music stands. The children were awkward at first. They had instruments that had been pawned back and forth, violins with missing pegs, guitars with warped necks. Elias fixed what he had, reherring bows with toothy patience, tying makeshift bridges from rubber bands, turning tape into a temporary mute. He taught them not just notes but stoicism, how to hold a phrase when everything inside wanted to unravel. Gabriel worked the press machinery with a merciless efficiency he had honed across years of edits and reviews. He briefed the festival's board with a plan that promised authenticity and redemption in equal measure. He convinced the artistic director to accept a short, unadorned slot on the evening's program and coaxed a camera crew into committing to a perspective that would not exoticize the children but present them as something immediate and human. Among the skeptical were the festival sponsors, a group of men and women who had grown used to receiving excellence packaged in silk. The festival's patronage committee needed assurance that their decision to rescue their funding would not be a second-layer scandal. Gabriel turned his persuasion into something that was equal parts surgical rhetoric and personal confession. He told them about the lobby violin and about how he had been stopped in the middle of the night by a sound that made him feel human again. He let his own astonishment be part of the pitch. The night of the demonstration arrived like a compacted breath. Critics and board members and a skeptical press corps filled the hall, their phones charged like a nervous army. The festival's commissioned work controversy still hung like a storm cloud, but the night promised a possible clearing. Elias stood in the wings and felt his old nerves. He looked back at the small group of children he had gathered. Their eyes were large, honest, and hungry. They clutched instruments with the fierce devotion of those who make do. Elias saw his son's face among them and steadied himself. He did not look at Gabriel. That man had already given enough, had put his reputation on the line, but had kept the promise to remain humble. Elias allowed gratitude to be its own small, fierce music. On stage they were announced and they walked into the light without a flourish. The hush that fell was full of expectation and skepticism, like a courtroom waiting for verdict. The first fragile notes rose and the critics leaned forward. The children's tempos were uneven in places, some intonation slid into blue. There were moments of visible frailty when a bow hesitated. The audience tensed in those places as if ready to withdraw its affection. Then something happened. Elias, who had begun the set with a simple tune, let the melody loosen into improvisation. He taught the children through example, inviting them to fill spaces with courage. He wove pauses into phrasing like a man mending a net, and the children, moved by the man's steadiness, found themselves following him with small bravado. It was not perfect. It was saturated with human risk, the precise kind of authenticity that could not be manufactured in a studio. From the house, Gabriel watched with a terrifying reverence. He had known, in a critic's way, when a performance carried the mark of lived truth. He saw, too, the ripple of this truth across the faces of the board and sponsors who had come as a formality. He watched the cameras capture not an exposé but a human moment. He felt the sensation of vindication, of the festival being saved by a reality it had earlier disavowed. He felt something else, too, a personal relief in honoring the man who had reminded him how to be moved. At the end, the applause was not thunderous. It was prolonged and steady, the kind that rewards risk and recognizes the cost. The room exhaled together. A few in the balcony wiped their eyes with dignity. A columnist from a rival paper whispered a phrase to Gabriel meant as a compliment and a threat: "This will travel." The next day, the story did travel. Gabriel's write-up did something elegant and unpretentious. It presented the performance as a testament to a different measure of excellence, a recalibration of what art's value could be. He wrote about mended violins and children who learned to play amid hardship and a man who chose purpose over limelight. The piece colorfully sketched the scandal's resolution. The festival reconstituted its committee, a sponsor renewed funding with conditions that included neighborhood art support, and the artist who had been accused of plagiarism agreed to an independent review that cleared the work of intentional misappropriation. The crisis abated like a receding tide. But the public vindication that mattered was personal. Elias was invited to speak at a roundtable on community arts funding. Schools called with offers to support the children's ensembles. A nonprofit offered to set up a long-term program with Elias as a director of outreach rather than a marquee soloist. The work offered more money than the night shifts and, more importantly, it promised a path that honored his values, working in his neighborhood, training children, and maintaining enough flexibility to be with his son. Gabriel gave interviews in which he acknowledged in public the misjudgment his profession sometimes made, that old critics' disdain was tempered into advocacy. He did not seek the spotlight of this rescue for himself. Instead, he wrote and spoke about the structural failures that had sidelined Elias and people like him. His tone changed in subtle ways that made his colleagues comment on the shift. He had become less inclined to dismiss and more inclined to amplify. He felt the satisfaction of someone who had finally used influence for repair. Elias's public vindication occurred in stages. At a press conference, presented by Gabriel as part of the festival's reconciliation, the director of the board said plainly that brilliance could be housed in unexpected vessels. He spoke of humility and of the festival's failure to hear voices below. He named Elias by his full name and recounted a lobby night that had changed the course of decisions. Elias stood at the edge of the podium, the microphone too tall, his hands smoothing clothes that could not hide the soot of his labor. Cameras lasered him and he felt, for the first time, an unaccustomed mixture of exposure and relief. Some of his old neighbors lined up to praise him, awkward in their affection. The music center hailed him as an architect of a new generation. Yet he felt most victorious in a quiet, practical way. The nonprofit that had made him director of outreach undertook to fund lessons and instruments for a full cohort of students. Gabriel set up a scholarship in his name that would ensure a sustainable support that could not be rescinded like a whim. Sponsors signed checks with their usual flourish and, in doing so, promised something practical. Elias's choice, once offered larger options, was not to accept the theater circuit's commitments that would take him away from home. He was offered a significant role as a solo artist, tour-managed and paparazzi-ready. He refused. He recognized the lure, higher wages, a gilded roof of new accolades, but knew what it would cost. He had been through stages where art was a commodity stripped of its carving knife, polished smooth and made palatable. He would not let his love of music be an item on a list he sometimes sold to survive. Instead, he negotiated an arrangement. He would retain the director position at the community program, travel only for events that directly benefited the children, and accept a small stipend from the festival to sustain his family as he organized youth orchestras. Gabriel facilitated this without fanfare but with thoroughness. He adjusted contracts, moved funds, and ensured that a governance board would honor the program's mission. He introduced Elias to a lawyer who pro bono handled the scholarship's terms. He used television interviews to highlight the children by name and the small program that would now be scaled. His influence did not force Elias into a gilded cage. The critic had learned a bigger lesson, that his power to name deserved a counterweight in his duty to build. Elias's son, Gabe, was most impressed by the ordinary things that followed. The boy was invited to a children's music camp at a nearby conservatory, and the first time he stood under a conductor's hand the look on his face was one that would become 1,000 small photographs. Elias watched and sometimes wept in the car alone because he had been allowed the dignity of being a father who paid the bills and a mentor who kept his hands in the instrument's wood. Months later, the partnership between the critic and the janitor-turned-community leader had matured into a real relationship of trust and purpose. They met often in the slow hours over coffee that tasted of a city's wake, not polished lattes. Their dialogue became collaborative, not transactional. Gabriel brought resources and a public voice, Elias brought a faithful humility and a moral center. They sometimes argued, about programming, about the risk of overexposure, about what constituted success, but those arguments were the kinds that knit bones. Those who had been skeptical, as many were, observed the transformation with a mix of irritation and admiration. Some critics argued that Gabriel's embrace of the underdog was theatrically convenient, a PR move. Others, who had seen the children's concerts up close, were silenced by the steady work's results. The festival sponsors, who had once been conservative and fearful of scandal, became experimental supporters of community programs, prompted by the measurable outcomes. Men who used to sneer at street-level talent found themselves in the audience at neighborhood recitals. Elias lived differently now, but not grandly. He kept his night shifts for the initial months because he trusted the rhythm of labor to keep him rooted. He taught in the afternoons and traveled occasionally for a program that demanded his presence, usually to neighboring towns, not glittering metropolises. He retained the broken violin in his case, now mended more carefully and with some new parts donated by a kind luthier who called him a name that felt like an honor. He took lesser pay than the solo circuit might have offered because the measure of success for him had shifted to how many children could stand and play without feeling invisible. Gabriel, for his part, attended the children's concerts not as a critic but as a friend. He would sit in the back and sometimes clap in a way that was louder and less condescending than he had ever managed on his own. He wrote little essays on the virtue of humility and published columns that urged institutions to listen. He did not stop performing his critic's duty, rather, he let that duty be shaped by the principle he had learned at the lobby door, to recognize and build where recognition had failed. Years widened into a habit of shared projects. They built a modest rehearsal hall in a part of town that had once been a warehouse district. Sponsors matched Gabriel's ability to give voice with financial structures designed to avoid the predatory habit of extraction. The hall had a low stage, good acoustics, and a bulletin board where children's names were listed like constellations. Elias painted the stage with his son and the other volunteers from the center. Gabriel negotiated the paperwork that made the hall permanent, a small city of sound that would outlast the two men's immediate fame. The skeptics softened in time as the work's impact became measurable: college auditions, music scholarships, the quiet dignity of families who no longer felt forced to choose between rent and lessons. Gabriel's influence moved from op-eds to policy meetings, where he lobbied for grant allocations that looked beyond performative checks. Elias' presence in the community became a stabilizing force. He was not a star in the tabloids but a father who taught in the drizzle of weekday afternoons, hands patient, voice soft. On a particular autumn evening years after that lobby night, Gabriel and Elias stood in the hall they had made together. The air had a smell of hot coffee and wood polish. Children milled around tuning their instruments, their shoes scuffing the floor in ways that made hearts smile. Gabe, now a teenager, adjusted his tie for a recital. He had the posture of someone who had been given permission to stand. Gabriel watched them as if from a small, privileged distance. He remembered the lobby's marble and a man hunched over a broken violin. He thought of the paper he had written years ago, the one that had shifted a festival and set a community in motion. He felt gratitude that had nothing to do with reputation. He had found in Elias not a subject for critique but a partner in building a world that refused to let talent be measured only by pedigree. Elias stood beside him with the violin strapped casually to his back. He looked older and softer in the face but no less vital. The man who once kept his music in the safe privacy of night had found purpose, not the footlights but the small, steady stages of a neighborhood. He had kept his choice to be present for his son. His hands had saved more than instruments, they had saved rooms. They had both been changed, imperfectly and beautifully. Gabriel's arrogance had been chipped down to something generous. Elias' invisibility had been replaced with influence measured not by applause but by numbers of children who could read music. The moral of their story was not a tidy concluding line but a steady practice, to notice and to act. In the hall's dimming light, Elias drew his bow across a note as a signal and the children arranged themselves. The music rose with the same fragile insistence as it had in the lobby years ago, but with more bodies and more reasons to exist. Gabriel listened and felt a truth he could now name without the need for rhetoric: recognition matters, but it is the choices that follow recognition which form the backbone of any meaningful life. Later, when the hall emptied and the cups and discarded programs were swept into an industrial bin, Gabriel and Elias sat together at a small table by the window. Outside, the city moved in slow constellations. The critic's need to adjudicate had been replaced by a steady curiosity. The janitor's old humility had become a quiet authority. "Did you ever think," Gabriel asked in a voice that had less and less of the clipped edge it once had, "that a lobby would change a life?" Elias looked out over the city and smiled, a small line that had learned seasonings of sorrow and joy. "Music changes lives," he said simply. "Sometimes it just finds a strange place to start." Gabriel nodded. "Sometimes it needs someone to notice." Elias looked at him as if counting off a list of debts and found the balance. And sometimes it needs someone with a pen who decides to build, not just name. They finished their coffee and walked out into an ordinary night. The city's lights hummed with the low satisfaction of people who have work to do and the courage to do it. In pockets and corners, instruments were tuned and practiced. In living rooms, children read notes like maps. Somewhere, a battered violin rested in a case-turned ceremonial instrument, its varnish shined. The two men had found a rhythm that would continue, one that tasked them with noticing and doing, with hearing and helping. Their story did not end with fame or fortune. It continued in the small, stubborn acts that make good trouble in the world, classes that ran despite budget cuts, scholarships that became pipelines, critics who remembered to use their voice to build. It was a story of two men who met one night in an empty lobby, and in the collision of their statuses, both found themselves less lonely. The final moral was simple and explicit, because both men had learned to savor the clarity of plain speech. Greatness is not always dressed for company, and mercy can be the most radical form of recognition. The midnight air tasted of rain and old tar as Gabriel and Elias walked away from the recital hall, their footsteps measured on the wet pavement. The city had a way of holding its breath between blocks, and in that hush every small sound became important: a distant siren, the clack of a shoe on metal, the muffled laughter of two people sharing an umbrella. Gabriel felt each sound like punctuation, a world that had rearranged itself into sentences he had not known how to read until recently. Elias was lighter in his step than he had been months ago. The work of the week left him bone-tired, but there was a satisfaction in the tiredness, like a stretched instrument settling into perfect pitch. He ran a gloved hand over the case that hung at his hip, feeling the roughness of the leather and the memory of varnish and rosin. Inside, the battered violin slept, as sacred as any relic. He had carried it past the hospital where his sister had once worked, past the laundromat where he had fixed a broken dryer once for free, past the stoop where a child he taught had once learned the scale of a minor and discovered that it made the world seem kinder. "You ever think," Elias said after a moment, "that the city is like an orchestra that forgot to read its own score?" He spoke lightly, but his mind had somewhere to go with that metaphor. He watched a pair of teenagers arguing softly on a stoop and thought of counterpoint, of lines that collided and made sense only when someone held them together. Gabriel laughed, a clean sound that used to be rare. He inhaled the metallic scent of the rain and the sweet tang of roasted coffee that lingered near a corner cart, as if the night were offering small consolations. "Maybe it needs more janitors," he replied, and the edge of the old irony lingered. He had once called himself a critic, a person who named and categorized. Now he felt himself becoming a builder of scaffolding for others. They passed a storefront with its lights dimmed and a handwritten sign promising lessons in math and reading for neighborhood kids. Elias paused and peered through the glass, his reflection merging with the posters inside. The sight pulled at a familiar current of thought in him, what it meant to teach, to give without theatrics. Teaching had been his first form of music. Before he performed publicly he had taught a few children in the community center how to bow and breathe, how to find a rhythm in their own hands. "We should go in," Elias said suddenly, voice low with a kind of urgent gentleness. He had that look then, closed mouth, lashes lowered, the man who measured his words because they could be tools as well as weapons. "Just to see. To leave a note, maybe to offer a rehearsal space when the hall is open." Gabriel watched him. He remembered days when he had scoffed at generosity, when every kindness was suspect, the product of some design. He was mindful now of the small decisions that built or broke things. He nodded. "Let's leave a note and a schedule. Make it official in ink, not just in our heads." They went inside. The room smelled of chalk dust and old paper, of crayons and a sweetness that felt like summer. The children had gone for the night. Folding chairs leaned against the wall like patient statues. A table in the corner held a jar of coins and a poster with a smiling teacher whose photograph had faded. Beneath it, someone had penciled a line about the place being in need of violin strings. Elias placed the case on the table, unlatched it carefully, and wrote on the back of a program he had kept from the recital. His handwriting was steady, small, the kind that belonged to someone who had learned to write in long silences. He wrote that the hall would donate practice time and that Gabriel would organize a list of volunteers from the orchestra and staff willing to help with mentorship. He let the pen pause, then added a line, "Free lessons to anyone who could not afford a teacher." Gabriel watched the movement of Elias's hand and felt an unfamiliar domestic warmth. He thought about language, the public sentences he had used in reviews and columns, the private sentences that now seemed more important. "You ever think about how many people never had someone to hand them the first bow?" he asked. He meant the question to be rhetorical, but a child's laugh from the street reached them and made him want a real answer. Elias smiled, "A private thing. You hand them the bow, you hand them permission. Sometimes that is all it takes." He closed the case, the click of the latch echoing like a soft metronome. He imagined the stoop filled with children learning scales, the elbow grease of a neighborhood giving way to tuned strings. They left a note, pinned with an old ticket stub to the community center bulletin board, and stepped back into the drizzle. The city looked different at the edges where light and shadow fought, alleys seemed less forbidding, a lamppost less lonely. They walked without deciding where they were headed, two men slow-stepping into a partnership that had no precise contract but an abundance of intent. Over the next weeks their rhythms braided together. Gabriel began to attend more rehearsals, his role shifting from critic to chronicler and sometimes to technician of morale. He learned the language of rosin and meter with a kind of careful curiosity, asking questions in a voice that wanted to hear the music's weight. He started a column in a modest weekly that did not adjudicate so much as amplify, telling the stories of apprentices, the elderly player who mended strings with steady fingers, the shopkeeper who smelled like cedar. Each piece was a small invocation of attention, a spell that drew notice and often donations. Elias continued to teach in the evenings at the center. He observed children who arrived with scuffed shoes and fierce attention, who discovered they could make sounds that changed the air around them. For some the violin was a tool of concentration, for others it was a mirror. Elias kept careful notes, the way teachers do, names, preferences, a melody that belonged to each child. He repaired instruments between classes, sanding bridges, replacing pegs, coaxing music out of tired wood. When he could not find a part, he created one from scavenged materials, an improvisation that became its own small triumph. One afternoon, as autumn bled into colder weather, Gabriel found himself in the back of the community center watching a small boy, no older than 8, take a bow for the first time. The boy's mother stood at the door, arms crossed, eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. The boy's hands were clumsy, his face went bright red when he misfired a note. Elias knelt beside him, demonstrating gentleness as if it were technique. "Slow," he said softly, "like you're telling a secret." The boy's note was rough and then became a shape. Gabriel felt something shift inside him, like a lock turning. He thought of the reviews he had written that praised virtuosity but often missed the quiet of learning. He had admired apex, but now he was learning the arc it took to reach that apex. The scene was not for an audience of critics, it was for the world that would be made softer by a practicing child. Later, as they closed the center and the city emptied onto colder streets, Gabriel asked Elias a question that had been hovering at the edge of everything. If someone offered you a job at the conservatory with a desk and a title and the kind of pay that pays the rent for a decade, would you take it? Elias looked at him in the half-light, the lines at his eyes deeper when he considered such things. He thought about the calendar of lessons, about the child with red cheeks, about the tiny perfect community that had grown around the battered chairs and the jar of coins. He thought about the violin in his case and the hospital where his sister had once worked, he thought of old debts and fresh possibilities. "Maybe," he said slowly, "but not if it meant I was handing up a ladder instead of laying it across the ravine. If I joined their system, would I still be able to teach on Friday nights to those kids who cannot pay? Would I still make instruments from parts in alleys? Would I be allowed to break rules if the rules are wrong? Titles are shelter, they can also be a cage." Gabriel considered this, the way a critic might study a score for a distant motif, then he surprised himself by answering as if his voice came from a person whose priorities had been rewritten. Then we will build a bridge instead. You will have an office of one if it helps you get the parts. I will make sure the conservatory gives you funding for outreach, not constraints. We will write the job to include the people, not the prestige. Elias's laugh then was soft and almost incredulous. You sound like a politician who learned to listen. Maybe I am, Gabriel said. But a politician with an editor's conscience. Their negotiations were small, intimate things. They wrote proposals over coffee, Gabriel's neat sentences clarifying how funds would be used, Elias's notes adding guardrails to protect autonomy. They met with an administrator who had long ago learned to measure everything by spreadsheets. The woman blinked a few times at the insistence that the proposal include apprenticeships and community hours, then nodded when Gabriel translated ideals into line items. The conservatory, pleased by the positive press and the idea of an outreach program that might refill seats in years to come, agreed to pilot a small fund and a satellite rehearsal room. The pilot was messy and perfect. There were nights when the heating failed and Elias taught with gloves on, nights when a benefactor's check arrived late and Gabriel had to cajole donors with the practiced charm of someone who had learned humility. There were also evenings of true music, when 10 kids crowded into a small room and the sound of their vibration was large enough to undam an entire block of sympathy. Back in his own apartment, Gabriel would sometimes wake at 3 in the morning and fold notes into a small stack on his nightstand, lines of praise he meant to write for the donors and sentences meant for the children, too. He dreamed of a city where recognition was not hoarded at the top but distributed like bread. Elias's image, his hands, had become a talisman in these dreams. He thought of the janitor's humility, how it had not been quiet from weakness but from deliberate restraint. They had critics to face still, old colleagues who thought that Gabriel had jettisoned impartiality, others who thought Elias was being groomed to become a useful ornament. Both men ignored these mutterings, listening instead to a different chorus, the gratitude of a mother whose son could now play something that made him smile, the steady growth of an apprentice's technique. The skeptics, like seasoned winter, thawed slowly. The author of a rival paper visited a rehearsal and walked out with the faintest moistness at his eye. One early evening, a stranger approached Elias in the alley behind the conservatory, carrying a case much like his own but newer, polished. The man introduced himself with an old name in the world of strings, a luthier from a distant town who had heard of the outreach program and wanted to donate parts. He spoke with a warmth that had the effect of sunlight on old varnish. He expected nothing in return, a rare and priceless generosity that Elias received with embarrassed gratitude. They accepted the parts, then organized a small workshop where older students learned to repair instruments and younger ones learned to care for them. It was an act of apprenticeship that went beyond music. It taught a hand to be useful and a mind to be patient. Gabriel wrote about the workshop in a piece that did not critique but celebrated. He wrote about the man who came to drop off parts and the way the kids took apart a violin as if it were a puzzle in which each piece held a secret. Their story continued to accumulate small scenes like these, mosaic tiles that together revealed a pattern more intricate than either could have planned alone. Night after night, the city furnished them with material, needs that grew into programs, programs that matured into routines, routines that turned into traditions. Gabriel learned to value the long arc over the sudden headline. Elias learned that structure could be an ally when it served people rather than prestige. And always, there was the music, the daily miracle that bent silence like light through a prism. They had not solved the city's every sorrow, nor had they healed every wound, but they had made an honest contribution. Each lesson, each repaired instrument, each exhausted but upright student was a small defiance against the indifference that had once seemed so total. In the quiet hours, when Elias would take the long way home and Gabriel would pause outside a bakery to listen to the baker's radios, both men found themselves less lonely. They had not reduced their lives to tidy statements, they had expanded them into something durable. There were still audiences to convince and budgets to balance, but the moral geometry of their days felt truer. They had moved from judgment and secrecy into stewardship and light. Yet neither man believed their work was finished. They had crossed an enormous threshold, but the landscape beyond it promised further tasks. New needs surfaced, and they met them with the same principles: notice the overlooked, translate resources into dignity, and defend the fragile autonomy of those who taught and served. The city kept its secrets, but it also started to hand back its music when asked politely and persistently.